So as folks are trickling in, I'll just introduce myself and start with a few meeting reminders and welcoming to everyone to our 7th meeting of Ask the Researcher. My name is Lindsay with the Ocean Protection Council, and I'll be facilitating this webinar alongside Steve Wertz and Becky Oda with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Kelly Sace with Strategic Earth. So thanks everyone for the support. It takes a team to get these webinars going. It's been a lot of fun so far, so we're excited to keep going with our last week of webinars. This webinar series was designed as an opportunity for interested members of the public to interact directly with our researchers involved in California's Mpa long-term monitoring projects. Our goal in facilitating this 8-part series is to support a broad understanding of the research that is informing our upcoming 2022 Mpa Decadal Management Review. So this is a response to some community meetings that were hosted by CDFW last fall. And those meetings were to both inform the public about the Decadal Management Review and both hear perspectives from different stakeholder groups. We had a couple of fishing-oriented ones, some recreational ocean users. And so one of the pieces of feedback we heard from all of the different groups was to hear directly from the researchers to help understand the science that is informing this review. So I might ask Kelly if we can bring our facilitation slides up. We'll look through a few of our webinar considerations and just Zoom reminders for everybody. If you haven't already noticed, this is a recorded webinar. We'll be posting the recording within the next 1 to 2 weeks. So that'll be available and shareable for everybody at that point. We'll go to, if we can go to the second slide. Great. So as you can see, we have a whole team of folks here. We'll be speaking with Drs. Ross Clark and Kevin O'Connor. You can see their full research team listed there. We also have our department partners, as I already mentioned. If we go to the next slide. Thanks, Kelly. Before we begin, I just want to go over some meeting agreements and webinar considerations. So I already said it's being recorded. If you have any difficulties viewing the screen or calling in, please get in touch with Kelly. Her email is right there. It's kelly@strategicearth.com, or send a message in the chat. When we do the Q&A section, we'll invite you all to raise your hand and you can unmute yourself to speak at that point, or you can put questions in the chat. And what will be really helpful as we move through the Q&A is if you are joining via Zoom on video, if you change your name, then we can identify you a little bit easier. So to do so, go ahead and click participants in the meeting controls, find your name and click more, and then choose rename. Go ahead and put your full name, and if there's some identifier that is helpful, you can put that in as well. It's a reminder to speak as clearly as you can. These are closed captions, so when people hopefully watch it a little bit later, it's a little bit easier for people to follow. And then if you want to go to the next slide, Kelly. Thank you. Just a few things before we get going here. Just remember to please stay muted when you're not speaking. We want to minimize distractions. Please listen for understanding and acknowledge and seek clarification from others' perspectives. Please openly discuss issues with others who hold diverse views and approach all discussions from a place of diversity and inclusion. Remember to keep your comments concise and focus on the topic at hand. So we're talking about estuaries and Mpa monitoring today. And a reminder that any personal attacks and offensive language will not be tolerated. And if you have any issues or concerns, please connect with the facilitators. Kelly's a great person, but always raise your hand or put something in the chat and we'll address it for you. We ask that everybody abide by these agreements. And if you're unable to, we'll invite you to leave today's meeting and watch the recording at a later time. You're also encouraged to email your input to CDFW at the address that Kelly will put in the chat. So without further ado, we are fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Ross Clark and Dr. Kevin O'Connor, who will give a brief presentation on their work conducting condition assessments and monitoring of estuary ecosystems. So after their presentation, we'll have plenty of time to hear questions from the audience. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Clark and Dr. O'Connor.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin O'Connor with the Central Coast Wetlands Group at Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, and Ross Clark is also joining us today. I'm at home and he's at the office, so we're zooming in. As for the presentation, I'll go through the first half of it, and then Ross will follow up with the second half. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can get started. Can everybody see the full slide? Thumbs up, Ross? Okay.
Yeah, we can see him.
Thank you. So the title of the talk today is a framework for condition assessment and monitoring of California's estuarine marine protected areas. Just want to acknowledge all of our partners on this project. So the project lead is the Central Coast Wetlands Group at Moss Landing Marine Labs, where we're working closely with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, CSU Long Beach, Sonoma State University, UC Davis Bodega Marine Lab, UCLA, along with the California Water Board, specifically the SFA region. Here's an overview of the talk today. We'll start off with a little bit of background and current state of estuary monitoring in California. And then we will go into our estuary Mpa monitoring project, looking at an overview of the project, some initial results, and then some links to management at the end. So the current status of estuary monitoring in California and Mpa monitoring in California. As far as Mpa monitoring, there's been a lot of work for those offshore Mpas over the past decade or so, those rocky reefs, the intertidal zone, the kelp forest, relatively long going. And some of those monitoring programs actually go back into the 90s, some of those rocky intertidal and kelp forest monitoring efforts. However, as far as the estuary marine protected areas in California, there has been a lack of coordinated and standardized monitoring effort across estuaries. So the project goal for this effort is to develop a monitoring and assessment framework for evaluating the condition of coastal estuaries and lagoons, and compared to the conditions in adjacent reference estuaries, and then linking those conditions to those offshore MPAs. And the idea is we can both look at the marine protected area estuaries as well as those reference or control sites for a good comparison. Getting a little deeper into that, this pilot program will establish an overall monitoring framework, including the data collection, the data analysis, the data synthesis, as well as the data reporting to determine the efficacy of those MPA designations on the estuaries in California. Taking a step back, MPAs in California, there are over 124 of them in the state, and that includes the offshore and estuarine MPAs. And just to zoom in, there are in fact 23 estuary MPAs in California, which isn't often known, and they go all the way from Humboldt Bay up in the north, all the way down to Famosa Slough down in the San Diego area in the south. And there is a variety of designations, as there are for the offshore MPAs, with different levels of regulation and restrictions on use and or fishing and whatnot. However, as we said before, the state lacks a way to assess the condition and effectiveness of those estuarine MPA designations, the point of this project. A little on the current state of estuary monitoring and some of the information and efforts that this project is building off of to have this more effective monitoring effort for California estuaries. So the Wetland and Riparian Area Monitoring Plan been in place for about a decade to a decade and a half in California, put together by a group of wetland monitoring practitioners in California, and just lays out a nice framework for linking management questions to different monitoring protocols, looking at results, and linking those back to management questions. And that's a nice framework we can work off of. There are several regional monitoring efforts within California focused on estuaries. There are the National Estuary Program, as well as the National Estuary Research Reserves. And those are in this SFA, Morro Bay, and Southern California. So those are regional monitoring efforts that are heavily focused, but not statewide. And then there has been the development of an estuarine wetland monitoring manual in Southern California, which pulls together a suite of protocol and analysis measures for estuaries that this program is really building off of and testing on. So getting into a little bit of the specifics of the ramp, I don't want you to get lost in this figure, just to say that It's been around since around 2010. And the idea is to go through this circle of planning and implementation where you have driving concerns, our concerns, MPA designation. You then look at your monitoring focus and your monitoring questions. How well are these MPAs doing? What is the effect on the estuarine systems? You develop models and the data needs to address those questions. Then you have your collection methods, which is what this project is working on, identifying those collection methods and how they work and how they answer questions. And that rolls into information dissemination to the public, answering questions, and then coming back and seeing, have we addressed our questions? Are we answering them? Do we need to make changes? So it's a nice circular process of monitoring program development. Looking at those national estuarine research reserves and national estuary programs in California. So again, these are focused monitoring and management efforts in several estuaries in California. The NERs are in the SF Bay, Elkhorn Slough, and Tijuana, while the NEPs are SF Bay, Morro Bay, and Santa Monica Bay. And those are kind of a breeding ground for neat research and evaluation of estuarine functions, but again, they're focused and not statewide. And finally, that estuary monitoring manual, this was put together a couple of years back in Southern California. It pulled together a great suite of different SOPs and protocols for looking at different parameters in estuaries. You can see on the left, water quality, soil, vegetation, fish, birds, mammals, and invertebrates. We're taking these, we're testing them out in estuaries, other types of estuaries in California and other regions of California to see if they are reproducible in other areas. So it was a great thing to build off of for our program. So what do we still need for this program? What does California still need to make it a more effective, holistic estuarine monitoring effort? So we need an overall assessment framework linking together these various regional monitoring efforts, as well as these various protocols that have been pulled together but not really implemented statewide. We need consistent universal protocols so we can compare between our MPAs, our control sites, to see how effective those designations are and the effect on the overall habitat condition and community. We need a way to effectively pull together all of the data that is being collected across the state and disseminate it to the public in the form of informational graphics, web interfaces, and whatnot to really get the information out to answer the questions. And then finally, a holistic way of implementing this framework across the state, which is going to take a lot of coordination. Through the development process, we pulled together an Estuary MPA Management Advisory Council, and this has representation of various estuary programs, coastal researchers, coastal regulators, to really support the development of this framework and this monitoring effort, and make sure that we are always keying back into how do we answer the management questions. We don't want to just collect data to collect data. We want to answer the management questions to make sure we are effectively monitoring these systems and feeding that information back into OPC and CDFW so we can effectively manage and go forward with these estuary MPA efforts. Overall strategy, it's a multi-layer monitoring framework. We want to leverage existing work as much as possible. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to take advantage of existing monitoring programs and then this existing monitoring protocols so that people don't have to learn a whole new suite of monitoring efforts. We're partnering with regional organizations, universities, and stakeholders to get the information out and also to implement the monitoring efforts. And finally, as I said before, use existing monitoring and assessment tools, don't create new ones. The MPA monitoring framework focuses on 4 key principles for long-term monitoring. 1, flexibility. We want to be able to assess the estuarine condition using a function-based approach. We have a variety of estuarine types in California. We have embayment and bays. We have seasonally tidal estuaries. We have lagoonal systems. They're all highly variable in their freshwater inputs, their saltwater inputs, their salinity, and their DO through time, but we want to have a framework that can work across all of them. So we settled on identifying functions that occur in these estuaries, and then protocols that assess those functions that can be altered if necessary, depending on the estuary you are in. You are still monitoring a specific function, but the protocol you use to monitor the function may be variable. Comparability. We want to be able to characterize these systems across a large geographic range. California has a huge latitudinal range from north to south. Again, very different levels of freshwater input and climate variability in those systems. We want to be able to compare information between estuaries. Interpretability, comprehensive and consistent sampling, very clear SOPs, how to do it, where to send the data, how to analyze the data so we can compare results. And finally, practicability, a feasible sampling campaign or design where a practitioner with a team of 4 to 5 support personnel can go out to an estuary and effectively monitor it in about 3 days to get the information needed to monitor that system. Here are the suite of monitoring protocols that we have settled on so far with this program. So we have various factors, abiotic factors, those physical factors affecting estuaries, biotic factors, the biotic system, the fish, the crabs, the benthic invertebrates, and then overall estuarine habitat condition. We're utilizing the California Rapid Assessment Method as an overall habitat condition metric, and then also looking at marsh plain vegetation, submerged aquatic vegetation, eDNA in the water and the sediments, as well as looking at sea level rise vulnerability and marsh plain accretion rates. And then finally, we're looking at watershed processes and stressors. What kind of stress is occurring from the adjacent landscape on these estuaries and affecting their function and condition? This is a very kind of complicated picture here, looking at all of those SOPs implemented in a single location within an estuary. When doing these estuary assessments, we have identified 3 monitoring stations within each estuary. We can go where we can go out and implement all of the SOPs and get a very good picture of function in that area. And we do it across 3 stations and overall have a good picture of what's going on in that estuary. Again, so if this is a smaller estuary, we just have 1 station. A very large one, you may increase it to more than 3, but we're saying that the good amount is 3 stations within each estuary to implement the whole suite of protocols. And here we have vegetation surveys in red, topographic surveys in yellow. We've got our eDNA in the water, crab traps, SAV surveys, water quality monitoring, all being done in a single zone. Here are the sites that we did our first initial implementation effort on. We've split the state up into 3 regions, north, central, south. We've implemented the protocols at both Mpa sites, so those are the ones with stars, as well as control sites, the ones without stars. And then here you can see estuary type. So we have bar-built estuaries, or those seasonal tidal estuaries, embayment bays, so those perennial estuaries that are always open to tidal input, and then these riverine systems where they're kind of halfway between a semi-closing system and a perennial open system. There's a lot of fresh water coming out, but it's still an estuary. So we have all types of estuaries across the 3 regions of the state. And again, our regional partners in the south and the north helped us implement these protocols. Data sharing and infrastructure. We've put together a great website, which you can go visit, empa.squirp.org, lays out the entire development process, has all of our protocols and SOPs. We'll be, by the end of the year, hopefully be able to allow the public to get data out of this system. Right now, it's a data repository with all of our QA checks to make sure our data are clean. And by the end of the year, we're hoping to be able to get data out of it. We'll also be utilizing OPC's Data One portal for storage of the information. So there'll be 2 sources of information for the data coming out of the project. This website is still under development, but it is a great resource for information on the project. So now I'm going to pass it over to Ross. He's going to take you through some of our initial results and then some links back to addressing management questions. Ross, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so as you all saw, we have a good geographic selection of a portion of the estuarine marine protected areas that we sampled and a suite of different data variables that we're collecting. The next challenge, of course, is to translate those data into some environmental or ecological interpretation to help us with our understanding the current condition of these estuaries, and then help us focus on maintaining or enhancing or adding additional management strategies to ensure that our estuarine MPAs are being managed well. First and foremost is to do a basic inventory and interpretation of the overall condition of our sites. And that's where we've used the California Rapid Assessment Method for wetlands. That tool has been developed for each of the different types of wetlands in California. And so we use the Esterine and the Barbell Estuary Cram modules to generate an overall Cram index score for each of our estuaries. And you can see the relative condition of each of our sites, with 91 being high, 58 being low among all our sites, with high sites in the north. We have and then some lower scores in the central and Southern California, often associated with some adjacent land use stress or stresses. So it's good just understanding our current condition of the estuaries. A lot of information goes behind these, but it's our first inventory scale data collection. So let's dive a little deeper into some of the various different ways that we can interpret data. The first question we have is the overall condition of our marine protected estuaries and any different than our reference sites? We had a number of reference sites and estuaries within each area of the state, and we looked at how the overall Cram score and among each of our three regions compares between our estuarine marine protected areas and our control sites. And you can see that there's very little difference in overall condition. And that's not surprising because marine protected area focus is on more of the fisheries and other habitat supports, which may not be translated from the Cram scores. So let's dive a little deeper and see where we can start to see some of the differences among sites and among regions. Here's some of our continuous monitoring of water chemistry within a number of sites within the Central Coast. And each of the lines represents a different site, including Carmel, Morro Cojo, Pajaro, and is that Arroyo de la Cruz? No. Yes.
Yes, it is, Ross.
Okay. And we can go through and you can see the first graph is of water depth or water elevation. You can see that each site fluctuates very differently. The purple, which is the Carmel, you can see has a classic river mouth embayment or bar-built estuary signal, where the beach forms in front of the river mouth, closing it off, causing the water to rise until it is overtopped, and then the bar erodes quickly, and you have marine mixing for a certain amount of time before that formation process begins again. And during the summer, you can see that it may be maintained for a long period where you have very static water elevations over the entire summer. Some of our other sites you can see, they fluctuate daily with the tides, often getting the high tide coming in and then lowering with some minimum baseline water elevation. Temperature, you can see a daily cycle in water temperature among many of them, warming as we move into the summer and early fall among a lot of these sites. Some fluctuate in daily temperature much more than others for various reasons. Salinity, again, each one of these locations has a very unique salinity cycle, from almost fresh throughout the whole summer to going hypersaline during parts of the day when the tides are appropriate. And then let's see, Arroyo de la Cruz, you can see that in the blue that we have these periodic salinity increases, probably associated with some wave overtopping or monthly high tidal conditions that cause saltwater to flow into the system. Dissolved oxygen, an interesting one. We try and maintain a certain level of oxygen for fish and invertebrates. And you can see in all of these sites, we have these very high variability between day and night, and which can also be impacted or managed by the other water chemistry, and specifically the tidal height and connection with the ocean. Next slide. Next slide, Kevin. Thank you. But each one of those estuaries, that was one probe in one location, and we realized that that's not a good way to interpret an entire ecosystem. It's from one sampler. So what we did is we've put out a number of loggers. This is for dissolved oxygen specifically at different locations within an estuary, to understand that there is variability among those different portions of the estuary, which may help us to understand that even when you have low dissolved oxygen, which the lower graph shows in blue and gold, you possibly at the bottom of the water column, you may have high oxygen water higher up in the water column or in a different location to help support fish species that are sensitive to low dissolved oxygen. You may have fine conditions in parts of the estuary, even when you have low dissolved oxygen in others. Next slide. Here again, you can see some of the variability in temperature and dissolved oxygen. And you can see how that variability is affected by whether the beach bar in front of the river mouth is closed, causing the water to be more consistent in water chemistry, or open, where you can see those tidal fluctuations, where you have interactions with the ocean, providing very different sets of water chemistry and ecosystem functions. And the interesting thing is, for a lot of these sites, you see those seasonal variability between the water chemistry, which makes them a more dynamic and variable ecosystem, which is very important to some species. Here's some of our comparisons of water chemistry between marine protected areas and reference, as well as between spring and fall. And you can see, for the most part, that the biggest difference in water chemistry is seasonality among the sites, much more than whether it's designation as a marine protected area. Next slide. Similarly, we can look at whether the system is always open. Some of our estuaries don't form bars, and compare them to the systems that do close. And you can see the ones that close, you have a much higher variability in the water chemistry. Salinity is a great example. Whereas the systems that are continually open, you do not see the same seasonal variability among sites. Next slide. We did do a lot of fish seines in these systems, and as of present, we have 1 year of data, and can show the high range and variability of fish within each of these estuaries. You can see the total abundance ranging from low hundreds to greater than 5,000 individuals during a 1 to 2 day fishing event. Next slide. We also can compare the abundance based on whether they're perennial open or temporarily closed. And this is a good initial set of information, but we'll really have to collect data for a number of years before we can start to see trends among species or trends between designations, marine protected areas or reference sites. Next slide. This is, for instance, an example of the fish populations between marine protected areas and the reference sites for all of the fish species we caught. And it's difficult now to interpret which are the dominant species, but we have top smelt, sticklebacks, and sculpin is some of the ones we find in many of these sites. And you can see that at least in some of them, they they do change in densities among these species between the spring and fall. And there does seem to be some signal designation, but we're not sure what that means yet. The next challenge is collecting in evaluating these systems is using all of the data that we've collected to help us understand how various ecological functions are being provided or are not being provided. And so to translate the various data that we've collected into some sort of ecological evaluation, we've identified a number of ecological functions that we would expect to see in these estuaries, and then have come up with a process to utilize the data that we have to interpret the level of function that is existing now, helping us to then drive management action in the future. So let's look at one where we've evaluated the data and have some results, which is sea level rise amelioration and resiliency. How well can these systems respond to the threats of sea level rise and be resilient to them? And for each of our functions, we come up with a condition statement that is a examination of what we would expect to see within the data that we've collected for a estuary that has that support function. For instance, for sea level rise amelioration, we'd expect dense marsh plain vegetation with different topography and different species. We'd expect to have a sediment supply that can support marsh secretion. We'd expect an overall good habitat conditions score for it to be resilient, as well as upland habitat area where the estuary could migrate and as sea level rise occurs, as well as a foreshore that can help maintain a buffer from the ocean. So let's look at some of the data. So for our various condition statements, for that function, we evaluated for the Morocco Slough here on the Central Coast. Does it have dense marsh plain vegetation? Yes. Is it varied marsh plain topography? Yes. Sediment supply, we've initiated the markers out on the marsh to interpret that, but we don't have second year data yet, so we can't begin to understand that. Overall condition, some areas would likely be resilient, others are a little bit low condition. That'll be something that we look to. And then a sufficient upland migration area to support sea level rise. And let's look at that one a little bit closer. The graph on the right is an interpretation of projected sea level rise and how it will affect the Morocco Slough as water increases in height. Different plant communities you can see in greens and yellow down here, Salicornia, Jaumea, Juncus frankenia, prefer different water elevations so that they are submerged at different rates and they have different soil water conditions. And what we have done is used LiDAR and other digital elevation maps to interpret are there areas within the estuary where those habitat and hydrology conditions could allow those different plant species to persist, even if they're at a higher elevation due to sea level rise in the future. And so let's look at a few maps of what that means. Yeah.
Just a quick time check. It's about 12:35.
Great. This is our last slide.
Awesome.
So this is our interpretation of sea level rise within the Morocco Slough. And on the left, you can see the current conditions with the different habitat layers based on water flooding of those areas presently. And as the water elevation increases, causing higher water within the estuary, by 2040, you can see that there is more blue and more mud areas, but you can see that there are areas where water can flood and continue to maintain a rich diversity of the different plant communities within the estuary. By 2070, you see that there is more open water, but we still have considerable areas of plant communities, much of which is actually migrating up further into the watershed. By 2100, however, you see that our model suggests that most of the plant communities will be inundated, flooded, and which will cause an open water habitat. The one thing we haven't taken into account, however, is sediment accretion rates on the marsh plain, and that's why we have initiated the quantification of how quickly the marsh plains can rise within these areas. We can then add that to these marsh resiliency estimates and better understand, will sea level rise overwhelm these marsh plains by 2100, or with sediment accretion, they can actually be more resilient. And the last slide, Kevin.
Fun pictures.
There you go. And here's just some of the pictures of our team. You can scroll to the next one. Out collecting the various data, some of the fish we catch, some of the transects we do on the marsh plain, in the water, etc. Just showing the diversity of habitat types and the various regional teams collecting the data. And that's the end of our data interpretation part of the presentation. We will continue to be working up the data into the fall and hope to have a data synopsis by the end of the year.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. And I always love seeing fieldwork photos at the end. So thanks for throwing those in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Kevin. That was a great presentation. I want to quickly direct the audience to the chat if you haven't already noticed. Kelly put a few links in there, including the estuary teams. We created a snapshot report, so it synthesizes their work so far, and that's in English and Spanish, and a link to their project website that they talked about earlier in their presentation. Now we have about 20 minutes to answer any questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you're more comfortable throwing your question in the chat, please do so. And if you're joining by phone, go ahead and press *3 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute for those on the phone. Just a quick reminder, we want to be asking questions about estuaries and MPAs. So keep the questions focused on the topic. We want to make sure we leave space for everyone to have a chance to speak. Give it just a minute here, and if not, I will ask a fun question. Let's see. Ashley Eagle Gibbs shared in the chat. She just said, "Thank you very much for the interesting presentation."
Well, you're welcome, Ashley.
I might ask one while people are remembering the great presentation. Could you just give us a little bit of insight for those that might not know? What are some examples of how estuaries are connected to our offshore habitats?
Ooh, very good question, Lindsay. So the estuaries of California often serve as nursery habitat for the species that are found offshore. So some of the crab species, some of those, the smelt and whatnot that travel offshore and provide energy for the food chain, utilize the estuaries as the nursery habitat. So that's a great connection between the onshore estuary MPA and the offshore marine protected areas. As well, sources of nutrients. They can be even stress, onshore estuaries can be sources of stress for those offshore, in addition to providing good nutrients. It all depends on the amount, the abundance, and whatnot. But there's that strong connection, that physical connection. Ross,
they can provide a filter or buffer from on land threats to offshore MPAs as well. And so having a healthy ecosystem between our land uses and offshore MPAs can be an important context. And then also many the bird species that reside offshore sometimes or on our beaches can often come into the estuaries as well for feeding at different tidal periods or different weather conditions.
I'd also add one more thing is that the connection from offshore to estuary MPAs, there's a transfer of nutrients going onshore as well. So some of those kelp forest ecosystems can provide nutrients to the estuaries, and that marine-derived rack and that marine algae gets washed into the estuary. It's the basis of nutrients for the food web within those estuaries.
Great, thanks for that. I'm glad you mentioned birds and rack too. We sometimes forget about those important components, and we did hear from Professor Jenny Dugan a couple months ago now, talking about that exact thing as well. So if you're interested, you can go back and watch that recording as well. We have one question in the chat from Grace Young. They're asking, what does Cram mean and its method?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Cram refers to the California Rapid Assessment Method for wetlands. It's a rapid assessment method developed along US EPA's 3-tiered monitoring framework. It's a tool you can go out to a wetland, identify an assessment area, and get a score for that area within about an hour or two. If you're interested to learn more, go to cramwetlands.org. Cram Wetlands is all one word. And we have a great website on the development of the tool and data interaction, data download, and whatnot to get information on that methodology.
And one of the things Kevin mentioned early on is to have consistency among data collection protocol. And Cram is one of the ways that we've worked to have a methodology that can really compile a lot of important environmental data about ecosystems in a way that helps us compare conditions among sites within an estuary as well as among estuaries or other wetland classes for that matter. And there have been thousands and thousands of, say, riverine Cram assessments that have been completed as well. So the cramwetlands.org website has a huge amount of data, and you can really delve in on our through our mapping links to information on a lot of sites, be they ambient conditions or habitat restoration sites.
Fantastic, thank you. And Kelly was helpful for everyone and dropped that link in the chat there, the cramwetlands.org. We have a couple more questions coming in the chat now, unless there's a hand raise. I can't see it right now. Okay. So in the chat, Leslie says, your projection shows a loss of vegetation over time, which will be probably a common situation for estuaries in California. Do you have any sedimentation rate data for any of the other estuaries, which shows that sedimentation may or may not keep up with sea level rise or slow down the impact?
Wonderful question. There are a number of researchers that are collecting sediment accretion rates using two different methodologies. One is a feldspar marker. We actually mark the sediment with inert white feldspar material, and then we can come back later and look, dig up a little bit of the marsh plain, and then look for that layer of white, and then measure the accretion rates since the time that marker was placed down. Our project, we have actually installed those markers in all 15 of the sites that we've been to. So we are now established the time zero for our sediment accretion rates at these 15 sites, which is really important. Until you've done that, taken that step, you really are not able to estimate the sediment accretion rates. For a lot of our open estuaries, more work has been done in the past, like Elkhorn Slough. They have a lot of these feldspar markers out that have been out for a number of years. And then there's also set stations, which are a much more accurate estimate because they take into account tectonic and settling of the marsh plain as well as accretions, which is another important part of the consideration. It's just much more expensive and labor intensive to put out those set stations. So the first question is, how quickly are these marsh plains able to accrete sediment? We're starting to evaluate that now. Some currently are, we've seen are accreting sufficiently to be resilient to at least some predicted rates of sea level rise, but as sea level rise increases in the rate, we'll better understand whether that continues to be true or not.
Thanks for that response. It's a tricky question, very complicated process
It's a
to
good
get
one,
that
though.
data. Yeah.
We're just very happy that we've initiated the data sampling in some of these smaller systems where a lot of work hasn't been done yet.
Yes, great point. Yeah, that's one of the great things about this project is getting data where data hasn't been collected before. Let's see here. So we have another question in the chat from Carla. They say, I think you mentioned this during your presentation, but could you speak a bit more to whether it's too early to compare performance of estuaries within MPAs and reference sites outside of MPAs?
You want me to go, Rob?
Too soon? Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we all agree it is too soon. We don't even understand, annual variability among fish, et cetera, let alone how they may preferentially use different ecosystems with different water chemistry or different, tidal signatures, et cetera. So there's definitely a lot more to study, and we definitely need a few years of fish data before we can get a good understanding of what the expected population dynamics of these different fish are within these various systems. And to note, we haven't even been to all of the MPAs. We had to do we selected a subset of them, and part of our hopes moving forward is to actually complete the same monitoring protocol at some of the sites we haven't visited yet, or work with partners that are up in those areas to utilize the protocol that we put in place. So yes, it's too soon. We are learning a lot to help us characterize the variability in water chemistry and other conditions of these different estuaries, which is helpful in our interpretation of the fish data. But as far as fish population data goes, we have a long ways to go. Do you agree, Kevin?
Yes, I agree. There are some other metrics that we're looking at comparing between the two, but especially for fish and invertebrates and whatnot, we will definitely need more time.
I have a follow-up question on that then. From what you're seeing so far, I know you're still in the thick of it, what would you say are the biggest drivers in fish community differences between estuaries and?
I'll add a couple, and maybe Kevin can add to that. Mouth condition in some of the river mouth systems that do close, that seasonal variability between being open to the daily tides and closed off really drives the types of fish that utilize these systems, partly because of the connectivity, partly because of the water chemistry differences within these areas. So that's a really important one. Kevin, do you have others?
I would just say that directly links back then to changes in salinity and dissolved oxygen. So, which are main drivers of fish species within estuaries, which ones are utilized. So, having a robust, I would just say having a robust within MPA and outside of MPA site list will allow for us to look for MPA versus non-MPA in perennial versus temporary closing systems. And the differences between them might be so large that the difference between MPA versus non-MPA between two estuary types might be hard to discern. So.
And something that Kevin's really taken the lead on is reaching out to some of our regional partners, friends of groups, stakeholder groups that are actively involved in these individual estuaries, to help us understand what the fishing pressure is on these systems, because a lot of the MPA designation is around limiting take of various fish, invertebrates, et cetera, of these ecosystems. And we currently don't understand what the the level of fishing pressure is outside of the MPAs, so that we can understand what the benefit to MPA designation is. So that's an area that we're going to need to work with our local partners to get a better understanding of the importance of a no-take zone within an estuary is, and use that to help us interpret some of the the fish species data.
I would just add that we have been in talks with the MPA Watch folks to help out with some of those efforts.
Yeah, that's a great resource and a great point, because some of our other MPA monitoring programs are saying that, of course, fishing pressure is a huge driver, right, in what you see in our fishing communities, but it's really hard to get that data and at the appropriate scale. So that's definitely a recommendation we've seen bubble up from a number of other researchers in the program. We have a few more questions popping up in the chat now. The next one comes from Tom. He's asking, how does ocean temperature rise affect vegetation loss in your example versus vegetation loss due to sea level rise?
How does temperature drive plant loss compared to sea level rise? Is that the question?
And
Yes.
Lindsay, if you pop to the next slide, just slide 8, it will come up. It's written there.
Great.
Reference.
Thank you.
Of course.
Changes in ocean temperature, Ross, affecting marsh vegetation. And I don't know if we can speak to that.
I would suggest that secondarily through the warming of some of the estuarine waters can lead to algal blooms like ulva, et cetera, that then could compete with or impact the marsh plain if that ulva is does end up on top of the marsh plain. So that is one way that changes in temperature will affect the marsh plain. But mostly what we've seen is that a more frequent inundation of a plant will cause stress, and over time it'll lead to it not being as robust or resilient within an area. So, which is why we're estimating that the plant communities are going to respond to sea level rise by migrating to a higher elevation as the water elevation rises. Fortunately, within the Morocco Slough, we do have a low-lying backshore area where those that habitat migration can occur, at least through 2070.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a few more. We have just 2 more minutes, so we'll see how far we get with these next questions, and then we can maybe ask folks to email the researchers or the CDFW or us, and we can help facilitate further questions after the webinar. We have one from Grace Young asking, are there any current community science or public education programs affiliated with this project? If so, who?
So down in South Coast, our South Coast partners have been working with a group at the Vegetation Estuary. And if you email me, I can get you that contact information. We have been working with the Morro Bay NEP, some on the Morro Bay project, Morro Bay site. And then I have to reach out to the North Coast folks and see who they've been working with. So those are 2 potentials. Ross, you have?
Well, and then we have the NERS, right? We have Elkhorn and Tijuana, which have wonderful, citizen monitoring efforts. And one of the goals is for some of the estuaries within the MPA designation, where there is a lot of good data being collected, we integrate that in through those local partners.
Yeah.
Great. I think we're, oh, sorry, Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, I can do this last one for Aubrey. So eelgrass, yes, SAV surveys are included as one of the protocols. For the Central Coast, we didn't want to repeat what Morro Bay NEP is already doing, so we're going to rely on the Morro Bay NEP's data for eelgrass monitoring. Some surveys were done in the South Coast, and then I believe some surveys were done in the North Coast, but the data have not been worked up yet. But yes, it is included as one of our SOPs.
Great. I'm glad you got that one. I know that was a quick answer for you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I see we have one other longer question, but I might connect Ross and Kevin with Ashley on that one, just because we're running out of time. So with this next bit, I want to transfer over to Steve with the department, who will give us an update on the decadal management review. And thank you again, Ross and Kevin, and everyone that asked questions.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, once again, Ross and Kevin, thanks. Great job. And it's really exciting to see the standardization of the estuarine monitoring along the entire coast. It's a big achievement for California. Within the next couple minutes we have left in this presentation, I wanted to touch on briefly why we're involved in this decadal management review. And as you may recall, planning for California's network was completed in 2012. And after that planning process, the department updated its master plan for marine protected areas from being a siting and planning document to be a forward-looking management document. And in that document, we established a 10-year management review cycle, which is based on the life histories of many of the species that live along the California coastline. And also it's administratively feasible. So we also at that time established the Marine Protected Area Management Program, which is composed of these 4 pillars that are shown here on this slide: outreach and education, research and monitoring, enforcement compliance, and policy and permitting. So we are at the apex of this 10-year review. We're heavily involved in looking at information that's been coming in from all 4 of those pillars. Of course, information that like Ross provided today and Kevin and the other key habitats, that information is being pulled in from long-term and baseline monitoring. You may remember in the past, baseline monitoring was collected in most of these habitats to establish the biological and socioeconomic conditions at that time. And then the most recent funding for long-term monitoring is helping us to see what's changed since those baseline projects. So that's a major component of the report. We've been working with California Native American tribes to understand better traditional ecological knowledge and to get their perspectives on our MPA management program. We've been reaching out with stakeholders the last couple of years. We had a nice series last fall. We had an open forum to discuss the decadal management review. We continue to receive input through our MPA management review email address. And this amazing series that OPC has been supporting with Ask the Researcher. I think we're getting a lot of bang for our buck with that program. That type of information internally, we're working with our law enforcement and fisheries scientists to understand some of the effects or not from MPAs inside and out. We were fortunate to get funding from the state to support several Ocean Protection Council science advisory teams. One to help us to develop effective or objective tools or questions to evaluate the functionality of the network. Another one looked at the potential for MPAs to be resilient, potentially to climate change. And most recently, there's a group called the National Center for Ecological Assessment and Synthesis that's pulling a lot of this data together and analyzing it. And the department is working with them to get that information together and report out it in our report. And I didn't mention it in this slide here, but this report to the commission will come out in January, and it will be available for the February 2023 commission meeting, which is next year. And in that meeting, we'll be talking about our gaps in our knowledge, identifying, based on all the information, some cost-effective monitoring strategies, and most importantly, we'll be highlighting adaptive management recommendations to move the program forward in the next 10 years. So we're really excited about it. A lot of this work couldn't be done with all our partners that we have across the state. And if you'd like to learn more about the decadal management review, I recommend you check out our webpage. Don't worry about writing these links down. Kelly's going to throw them in the chat. I think she has already. And you can also email us at MPA Management Review. We try to respond within 48 hours to the questions that we received. So with that, that was my 2-minute drill. Once again, appreciate all the work you and your colleagues have done, Kevin and Ross, and I'll pass the mic over to Lindsay.
Thanks, Steve. Again, thanks everyone for sticking around. It's always fun to have time to talk science with our MPA researchers. So thanks again to Ross and Kevin for a great presentation and everyone for asking such good questions. We have our last webinar this Thursday from same time, 12 to 1, using the same Zoom link. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Rick Starr, who's going to talk about his team's work in the mid-depth rocky reef habitats. So please join us for our last one. It's been great having you all and hope you have a great rest of your day.